I'd like to talk about willful objects in Tolkien's writings, particularly The Hobbit. You might be wondering what I'm going to include. You can see that I've mentioned the Arkenstone and the ring, but perhaps the most humorous willful object, an object that has agency, personality, and voice, is the troll's purse. When Bilbo tries to steal the purse, pick William's enormous pocket, there was a problem because trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. "Here, who are you?" it squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck. I'm not going to talk much about trolls' purses. Are there any other willful objects, perhaps in The Hobbit? Maybe the swords that glow in the presence of goblins. There seems to be something in Tolkien's world about things having personalities, having agency, being able to influence events. I've mentioned the ring, and I will talk about the ring, but oddly enough, and this is going to be one of my points, the ring is not really so important in The Hobbit, compared in contrast to The Lord of the Rings. But to get us going, let's think about treasure, and I'd like to take you to the film The Hobbit and show you a very brief scene from the film The Hobbit.
The misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to find our long forgotten gold. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, it flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light.
But it's a great scene, and because it's a film, they concentrate on, you can see from your handout that my text is slightly different. My selection from that particular song of 10 stanzas is rather different to the film director's selection. They were interested in the fight with the dragon. I'm much more interested in the gold. And you'll notice that fourth line in the first stanza. It varies throughout the song. If you were to redo that song with all the stanzas in there, you get a refrain at the end of some of the verses, to seek the pale enchanted gold, and variations on that theme. And that's what we're interested in, enchanted gold, gold that has been transformed in some way by human will, mixed perhaps with the skill of the goldsmith, and perhaps also the skill of the enchanter, the magician. Notice it in the next two stanzas on the handout. There is talk of shaping the light that they caught to hide in gems. This is the idea which goes back to Silmarillion and its earlier version, the Book of Lost Tales, about how light is a palpable object that you can catch or gather and somehow inject into the craftsmanship of your work. On silver necklaces, they strung the flowering stars. On crowns, they hung the dragon fire. In twisted wire, they meshed the light of moon and sun. Twisted wire is probably an allusion by Tolkien to the kind of filigree, very fine gold wire that you see on such objects as the Alfred jewel or parts of the Sutton Hoo treasure from 7th century East Anglia, 6th century East Anglia. So the influence of early medieval East Saxon, Anglo-Saxon, Mercian metalwork and culture is something which I think we're going to be looking at today. Notice the Hobbit's response to that song. This is printed, still number 1 on the handout. As they sang, the Hobbit, Bilbo, the Hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him, a fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. It's fierce, it's jealous, it could be positive, it's certainly an intense admiration for the work of the goldsmith, the work of the artisan. And it goes back, as I hope to show, to Beowulf. You can see in number 2 on the handout a quotation from the end of the poem Beowulf. In the Old English it goes, "You monogold galdre bewunden," and in Tolkien's translation, which is now published, of course, although the line numbers, as you can see, are totally apart, causes immense confusion in classes, I have to say. The gold of bygone men wound about with spells. Far be it from me to quibble over Tolkien's translation, but actually I will, with spells. Galdre is the word he's translated with spells here. Galdor is from a verb gallan, to chant, and Galdor means chantment, enchantment. So you can see that when he's using a word like enchanted in his modern English, in The Hobbit, he may be thinking of spells and enchantment in the Old English, Galdor. So that's a little bit of the background on what I want to be thinking about today. Here's Tolkien himself, probably in this college, sitting in his study. I'm not absolutely sure when that was taken, but it's appropriate that we're not too far from where he was actually sitting. He published The Hobbit in 1937, and it was immediately compared to this work of literature by another Oxford Don in the Victorian period, Lewis Carroll, Dodgson, Alice in Wonderland, and Through the Looking Glass. There are many influences, though, that went together to form The Hobbit, including, as I've said already, Anglo-Saxon archaeology. There's an Anglo-Saxon sword, and there's a sax. Fairy tales about goblins. George MacDonald is perhaps a good example, also one of C.S. Lewis's favourite authors. The countryside, which is no longer countryside in the western side of Birmingham, you can still visit the old mill where he and his brother used to play, Sarehole Mill. It got into The Hobbit in the illustration there of Hobbiton across the water. In 1911, before he went to university, he went on a tour of the Alps. That certainly influenced the mountain scenes in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and in the Silmarillion as well. His life at Oxford, his experience of hospitality. He even invented a word on Old English patterns for the kind of hospitality that he liked to promote: guest kindliness, the sacred duty to provide a guest with kindly welcome. Guest kindliness is the word that should have existed for hospitality before the French and the Latin influences came in too much. His experience then, after his time as an undergraduate in the war, the devastation of the war, back in Oxford, and then off to Leeds for 5 years to teach, among other things, Beowulf. You can now find out his attitude, his interpretation of Beowulf, not only from his famous lecture on the topic, but also from his commentary and his translation of the text, which you can find in that volume. Archaeology, as I say, the landscape of early medieval archaeology, the many mounds, the artifacts that remain, such as the Beowulf manuscript, charred around the edges, but for most people, but not all my undergraduates, a relief that it wasn't all destroyed in the cotton fire. The mounds that you find all the way across the English landscape, Essex, you can see these mounds in the mist, often waiting for their treasure to be discovered, as was just before the war the mound at Sutton Hoo, which contained a ship and a sort of house in the middle of the ship, in which was housed presumably the body of a great king and all his treasure buried with him. As you can see if you visit the British Museum, here is the twisted gold and the symbolism of early medieval craftsmanship. The Sutton Hoo helmet there with its serpent. And is that a bird meeting the serpent, or is that a dragon? Beowulf itself, of course, is very much concerned with treasure and dwelling on the significance of treasure. This is towards the end. This is what dragons do, according to the Beowulf poet. Hey, that is he, the dragon, Yssechen shall, he must seek out, hoard on Hrusan, a treasure hoard in the earth. There he heaven gold wareth, where he sort of dwells upon the heathen gold, wintrum frode, wise in winters. It doesn't do him any good. There is a disapproval, if you like, of treasure at the end of the poem Beowulf. Even though Beowulf himself does not share that disapproval and imagines that he has achieved, through his death, through his defeat of the dragon, he has achieved the gold for his people. But his people are aware of the curse and they bury the gold with him in Beowulf's barrow at the end of the poem. That was a bit of a spoiler if you haven't read the Beowulf, but the poet himself gives plenty of indications of what's going to happen. So here's another moment from that poem. Freya shallward. Freya is the Lord, in this case it must be Beowulf, gazed for the first time on the ancient work, Fernewök fear of men, for Mansida, for the first time. There is in Beowulf, on many occasions, this notion of gazing upon the treasure. And it's something that we find in the Silmarillion, in the Hobbit, in the Lord of the Rings. And it can be a positive action, but I'd be careful about gazing too long on that treasure. You never know what might happen to you. Let's move on to The Hobbit now. And this illustration is from the first American edition. There on the screen is the first edition in Britain from 1937. It was so successful that he was immediately asked, by Christmas, they were asking him to do a sequel, and he started writing it then, but he took far longer to finish the sequel, which eventually became The Lord of the Rings, published in 1954 and 5. Incidentally, if you happen to find this lying in, sitting on your parents' bookcase or in the loft, do hang on to it. That copy is worth probably £7,000 or £8,000. If it happens to have JRRT signed in there, it might go for £150,000. So do be careful with these first editions. What's interesting about the first edition, though, is that it's different to the second edition, which he published in the 1940s, when he knew that he was going to, or that he was aiming to publish The Lord of the Rings. And he says at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, this tale, I forgot the quotation. It's something like, this tale grew in the telling, that's it. This tale grew in the telling. Well, so did The Hobbit, because he had to change The Hobbit to make it fit in. Most of the changes were subtle changes, apart from chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark, where he had to change the whole, I'll come on to that in a moment, but he had to change the whole slant of the story in order to make the ring more important and to prepare for The Lord of the Rings. There's the front cover from The Hobbit, and we can see that in the next quotation, this is the moment from the actual Hobbit second edition. He crawled along for a good way. This is after he's been left lying in the dark with a headache after the others have ran ahead and he's bumped his head, and he finds himself in a dark tunnel and doesn't know where he is. He crawled along for a good way till suddenly his hand met with what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it, and neither did Tolkien at the time. He wrote that final sentence. It was a turning point for the second edition, but not for the first edition. And we all know, of course, what happened to the ring in The Hobbit. For a start, it was much more efficient by the time Frodo is using it in The Lord of the Rings. In Bilbo's story, he has to be careful not to step into strong sunlight or torchlight, because his shadow will be seen. When he puts the ring on, there's no strange kind of effects of perception. It's much more workaday, the ring in The Hobbit. Here's a passage from The Lord of the Rings, The Shadow of the Past. This is Gandalf talking about Bilbo. Bilbo said it was growing on his mind. That is, the ring was growing on his mind. He was always worrying about it, but he did not suspect that the ring itself was to blame. But he had found out that the thing needed looking after. It did not seem always of the same size or weight. It shrank or expanded in an odd way, and might suddenly slip off a finger where it had been tight. And we certainly know that this is what happened in the history of the ring. If you explore the background in the appendices and in the Silmarillion, it slipped off Isildur's finger when he was swimming across the river, and the orcs found him and shot him dead with their arrows. The ring is treacherous, and it was, after all, created by Sauron himself in order to try and rule the other rings that had been created by the elves and the Here's an example of what the ring could do to people, even worse than what had happened to Bilbo. This is a scene where Gollum tries to sneak up on Frodo and Sam as they are crossing towards Mordor, towards the towards the end of the Two Towers. Gollum, this is the typical Gollum scene, which actually the film The Lord of the Rings does pretty well. We will swear to do what he wants. Yes, yes, said Gollum, still twisting and grabbing at his ankle. They've tied an elvish rope round it. It hurts us. Swear, said Frodo. Smeargle, said Gollum suddenly and clearly, opening his eyes wide and staring at Frodo with a strange light. Smeargle will swear on the precious. Frodo drew himself up, and again Sam was startled by his words and his stern voice. On the precious, how dare you, he said. Think. It will betray you, he goes on to say. So that's the effect of the ring on people who own it, people who are in touch with it, people who sometimes come into contact with it, people who see it. Think of what happened to Boromir, the desire to hold the powerful ring. It's about it's a symbolic element of the Lord of the Rings, really, this desire for power, the idea that the ends justify the means. You can read all about this in Tom Shippey's The Road to Middle-earth, very much one of the key works of Tolkien criticism, The Road to Middle-earth by Tom Shippey. So the effect of the ring, as Shippey points out, is almost like some kind of very powerful drug. It causes addiction. But not everybody is an addict, of course. And some people it doesn't seem to affect too much at all. Sam, for some reason, is not too affected by it. Most startling, of course, is Tom Bombadil. He even puts the ring on and it doesn't make him invisible. But he may be a special case, of course. But the two brothers, Boromir, Faramir, Boromir's fascinated, wants to own it, starts to forget himself in his urge to acquire the ring, even by violence. Whereas Faramir himself is interested, but does not take it. Let's go back to The Hobbit, and then looking at the history of The Hobbit. 2 volumes edited by John Rateliff, where you can explore the earlier drafts of The Hobbit. You could also look at the annotated Hobbit, which is also another very useful volume for this. And I believe the first edition of The Hobbit is actually it has been reprinted more recently, if you were interested in exploring this. So here's a text now from one of these earlier drafts, and this is Gollum in the scene of what eventually became Riddles in the Dark, and Rateliff has given it the title Gollum to separate it. It's the earlier version of chapter 5, then, if you like. And Gollum says to Bilbo, "Does it guess easy? It must have a competition with us, my precious. If precious asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If it asks us and we doesn't answer, we gives it a present." We gives it a present. Gollum, in the original version, is saying he is willing to give the ring to Bilbo if he wins the riddle competition. This is evidence, if you need any more evidence, that the ring is really not the same ring in The Hobbit as it is to become in The Lord of the Rings. What happens when Bilbo finally reveals his magic ring to the dwarves? You might imagine that one or two of them would start, that the narration would hint at the dark gleams in some of their eyes. Oh, this is something that I want. As you get with Boromir, even at the Council of Elrond. But no, let's have a look. This is from the Hobbit itself, from the final version of the Hobbit. Knowing that, well, not the final version, from the second edition, let's put it like that. Knowing the truth about the vanishing did not lessen their opinion of Bilbo at all, for they saw that he had some wits, as well as luck, and a magic ring, and all three are very useful possessions. It goes on, but very soon they began to ask questions. They had to have the whole vanishing business carefully explained, and the finding of the ring interested them so much that for a while they forgot their own troubles. Okay, strong interest, but no real desire to get hold of this ring and use it for themselves. Here's Shippy summing up. The Bourgeois Burglar is his chapter in The Road to Middle-earth, and he said, basically, in his straightforward way, the ring is just a stage prop, but also a prop for Bilbo's status with the dwarves. It's like a Colt 45. It's an equalizer. It makes you into a hero, as Bilbo. And in a way, that's what happens. Bilbo is emboldened by the fact that he has this ring. But, as I say, it's not the kind of willful agency hidden somehow within the ring, causing and affecting people's behavior. So what is, well, you can tell from my title what I think is, there it is, the Arkenstone. The Arkenstone. And the Arkenstone has a long history. It goes etymologically, it goes back to an Old English word for a precious stone. Eorkenstan, Eorklanstan are the two forms of it. If it was in its Mercian form of Old English, it might have been something like Arkenstan. If it was in a Norse version, it might have been Arkenstein. You can see the way Tolkien thought in terms of Germanic languages and the culture, the ancient culture that lies behind the extant Germanic languages, the culture and the poetry influencing each other. This is some old idea. This is typical of the way he thought. And he wove it into his mythology that he was writing at the end of the First World War, and which you can read, with great interest in the Book of Lost Tales. So number 6 on the handout gives you an example of the kind of writing he was doing in the Book of Lost Tales. Unfortunately, it's not finished, but it has a frame tale about a traveller who travels to a far distant island, travels through the countryside, receives guest kindliness from the elves, and hears tales and stories in the sitting by the fire in an elvish house called the Cottage of Lost Play, which actually resembles Rivendell in many ways. But the writing itself is like something between maybe William Morris and Lord Dunsany, if those are names familiar to you, and the style of writing that he chose to use for the later Silmarillion. So there's more detail, there's more dialogue, there's more space for descriptions, for revealing character and so on. In some ways, that makes it a more interesting read, and then very frustrating when you find that chapter is not finished, or there are only notes for it. But some of the chapters are complete and worth having a look at. Anyway, this is the moment when the elf Feanor of the Noldali notices what the other branch of the elves, the Solosimpi, are doing as they explore this new world in which they find themselves. And they're making their own acts of secondary creation, you might say. Great pearls, filled with luminous phosphor light. This is number 6 on the handout. He took the sheen of pearls, I'm at line 4 now, and the faint half colours of opals. He bathed them in phosphorescence and the radiant dew of Silpion. And but a single tiny drop of the light of laurelin did he let fall therein, and giving all those magic lights a body to dwell in, of such perfect glass as he alone could make, or even Aule compass. So great was the slender dexterity of the fingers of Fëanor. He made a jewel, and it shone of its own radiance in the uttermost dark. And he set it therein, and sat a very long while, and gazed. Notice that word, gazed. Showered in Old English. Gazed at its beauty. Then he made 2 more, and had no more stuffs, no more material. And he fetched the others to behold his handiwork, and they were utterly amazed. And those jewels, handiwork, by the way, is almost a calque on an Old English word, handiwork, the work of your hands, the craftsmanship. They were utterly amazed, and those jewels he called silmarili, or as we may say in the name of the speech of the Nolde, today silubrilthin. Yet have all held, who ever saw them, that the silmarils of Fëanor were the most beautiful jewels that ever shone or glowed. That's a description that you get in the Book of Lost Tales. And if you continue to explore the history of the Middle-earth, if you've got the time and the patience, you will find some Old English chronicles that Tolkien himself wrote. And what is the Old English word for a silmaril? It is, as you probably guessed, Arkenstone. So the connection between the silmarils and the Arkenstone is palpable. And the connections between the war between the elves and the dwarves, which is told in the story of the necklace of the dwarves in the Book of Lost Tales, and in the ruin of Doriath in the Silmarillion, this is number 7 on the handout, is also very palpable. Although so the legend does lie behind the early versions of The Hobbit, even though Tolkien found himself having to distance all that mythological background again when he changed the story in the 2nd edition to make it fit with The Lord of the Rings that was on its way to being published. But you can see that the ruin of Doriath, or the necklace of the dwarves, is about avarice, about greed for treasure, about the fact that treasure has a mind of its own, that the Silmarils can exert influence. They haven't been made by Sauron, of course, they've been made by Fëanor. So they do not have that utter evil agency that the One Ring seems to possess. The One Ring of the Lord of the Rings, that is. But there is agency in the Silmarils. Thingol sat long in silence, gazing, Shawada, upon the great treasure that lay upon his knees. And it came into his mind that it should be remade, and, and in it should be set the Silmaril. For as the years passed, Thingol's thought turned unceasingly to the jewel of Fëanor. This obsession that starts to take over people when they're connected with this kind of artifact or treasure. Tolkien sometimes calls it glamour, the sort of magic effect, enchantment, bewilderment, curse sometimes even, bewitchment. These are words that you can find in his early writings and in The Hobbit. So what I want to suggest is that the Arkenstone is a kind of silmaril, or maybe an actual silmaril, hidden away in, as it were, or its identity is hidden away in the original story of The Hobbit. What happens when Bilbo explores the treasure in that chapter, Not at Home? The dragon has flown off in order to attack Lake Town, and first the Hobbit is sent back into the treasure chamber of the dragon, and the dwarves eventually follow. But they watch him at first, making his way with his torch up the mound of treasure, and they see him pause for a moment and bend down. And why does he do that? The narrative then shifts, and it gives us Bilbo's perspective. He's walking up the mound of treasure, and he sees this glint, and he is drawn. It's this past participle. He was drawn. He was drawn. It's repeated about 3 or 4 times in the story. It's as though the Arkenstone is pulling him, encouraging him to take it. It's even a bit like in Beowulf when it says that the thief who stole the cup from the dragon's hoard, his hand grabbed it. It wasn't really him, it was his hand that grabbed it. It's the same with Bilbo when he takes the cup. He was drawn towards it and his hand took it. So there's something about this treasure, and in particular about the Arkenstone. And why does Bilbo need the Arkenstone? That's his 14th share of the treasure. He needs it to broker, well, this is his intention anyway, to broker a kind of peace between the army of Lake Town and Mirkwood and the army, this very small army of the dwarves who are defending their treasure under Thorin, who of course has been totally taken over by obsession with the treasure. So it's affecting people in different ways. It's made Bilbo more canny. And how is this Arkenstone described? And why should it be behaving in the way it's behaving? Perhaps to finish off with, we should look at Thorin's description of the Arkenstone, the fascination that it exerts on people, but also the notion that it's somehow the heart of the mountain, that it belongs in the lonely mountain, that somehow it's the soul of the mountain, and it needs to be restored to the mountain in order for there to be peace at the end of the story. So that's my thesis. I'm going to finish by reading that quotation, and then we'll have some time for questions if you have any. But fairest of all was the great white gem, which the dwarves had found beneath the roots of the mountain, the heart of the mountain, the Arkenstone of Thrain. The Arkenstone, murmured Thorin in the dark, half dreaming with his chin upon his knees. It was like a globe with 1,000 facets. It shone like silver in the firelight, like rain upon the moon.